Hello, and welcome to the second webinar of the AtScale webinar series. This webinar series is designed for AtScale customers. Every 2 weeks, we run a 30-minute presentation that will take a deep dive into an AtScale implementation. We'll focus on topics that will help you understand AtScale's technology, plan your analytics projects, prepare your data for BI, and explain how to develop and deploy AtScale to make information available to your business users in the most efficient and performant way. I'm Carol Gunst, Marketing Director at AtScale, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Kamlesh Sharma, Customer Success Manager at AtScale. In this session, he will review AtScale's architecture, key features enabling informed AtScale architecture, and enterprise deployment decision-making. Just want to mention that all participants are in listen-only mode. We do want to open this up to QA if there's time at the end, so please add your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen and we'll take them at the end of the presentation. And now, let me hand it over to Kamlesh.
Thank you, Carol. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. As Carol mentioned, this is the second webinar in the series of webinars we have planned for you. This one will specifically focus on how do you plan for an at-scale implementation. Let's get started. So in this webinar today, what we will cover. So what we are going to cover today is we are going to review information related to key aspects of the system that is helpful when planning an at-scale implementation. I have prepared this webinar to assist at-scale team members to better prepare for an at-scale implementations. And as you're planning for an at-scale implementation, there are several aspects of the system you have to think about. And I have listed those aspects here, right? You're thinking about the infrastructure related questions. You're thinking about the security. You're thinking about data platform. You're thinking about SQL engines. You're thinking about integration, automation, and data design. And I will dive into these aspects and point out key information which will be helpful and you should be aware of and will be handy for your teams as you prepare for your at-scale implementation. So the first topic is infrastructure related. Of course, if you're deploying at-scale in your environment, as you plan for the installation of at-scale, a couple of key points which I have mentioned on this screen are, you should be aware that there are certain ports that need to be open. I have given a few examples here, like the AtScale engine requires port 10502, the modeler requires port 10500. Now there are other ports that are required and that need to be opened, and a complete list of ports are available in the AtScale documentation. But that's an important aspect when you're planning for an AtScale implementation, for you to know that you will need to work with your infrastructure teams to get those ports open. Of course, there are CPU and memory requirements with every software, and I have mentioned that. Again, this is information that is mentioned in the AtScale documentation. So I will highly encourage participants here to go through the AtScale documentation for complete information, but I'm trying to highlight the key aspects you should consider or you should be aware of when you're planning and interacting with internal teams, because you will be interacting with internal teams to get the deployment done. There is a concept of open file ulimit. Your system admin, especially your Unix system admins would know about this. So you should tell them that, from an at-scale standpoint, we need the ulimit to be unlimited. In some cases, your system admin may push back and say, why do we need unlimited, right? Any setting, when we say unlimited, from an enterprise architecture or from a system administration point, you may get a question like, why do we need unlimited? Well, it's just recommendation. But the very least, we want those U limits to be greater than 62K. If you are in a Hadoop environment, you will be, AtScale platform will be interacting with the backend, which may be, Spark and Cloudera, and the Yarn resources come into play. So the Yarn resources, the minimum recommendation for Yarn resources, if you see there is a parameter called Yarn scheduler maximum allocation MB, we recommend that to be 18 GB. So these are some of the key aspects from an infrastructure standpoint you should be aware of. And I'm going to switch to the AtScale documentation just to show you. If you go to the AtScale documentation, you can get the list of ports and the additional information I'm talking about, memory and CPU and software, OS, utilities, the U limit, all the other configuration information, which will be helpful when you're trying to ask your infrastructure team to assist with the deployment. The other aspect when you're planning your AtScale deployment is security, and this is huge, right? You want your platform to be secure. So from an AtScale standpoint, you should be aware that AtScale supports Kerberos for authentication and communication with the Kerberos secure data warehouses. You may have Cloudera, you'll have Hive, you may have other backend systems. So the key part which I'm wanted to bring to everybody's attention here is, as you are trying to deploy AtScale in your environment, you should be aware that AtScale supports Kerberos, but AtScale will only test with a 3-part Kerberos principle. Now, your Unix admin or your system admin needs to know that key piece of information. The Kerberos principle needs to be 3-part for Kerberizing AtScale. People who are familiar with Kerberos and know that part of the world, essentially 3 parts of the Kerberos key are: you have a primary part, you have an instance, and you have a realm, which is usually the domain name. So your system admin, your Unix admin will appreciate if you can tell them that AtScale needs a 3-part Kerberos principle. Similar to that information, if you are planning an enterprise deployment, you are going to hook up to your LDAP server, your enterprise LDAP server, or your enterprise Active Directory. In that case, you will need to work with your admins there to get some key pieces of information, because you will need to keep that or get that information so that that information can be keyed into the AtScale platform for AtScale to talk to your Active Directory or LDAP servers, so that you don't have to, recreate the users and roles and groups or duplicate them in AtScale. Now, AtScale supports roles and permissions, and AtScale also supports groups. So your Active Directory groups can be mapped to AtScale roles and groups, and you can secure the AtScale platform at the very granular level, which is at the permissions level. There are 3 default AtScale roles that are available in the system. One is the design center role, the other is the organization admin, the third one is the runtime query user. So these are 3 default roles that are kind of preset for you, but you can create new roles, you can create groups, and you can control access to the AtScale platform through the outside of these 3 default roles and groups as well. The other aspect of the system is the data platform. Of course, after you get past your installation and you are hooked up into your Active Directory, the other key aspect of the system you are looking at is, how do I connect to my data warehouse, and what are some of the prerequisites when connecting to my data warehouse? So what I'm showing on the screen is, from an AtScale standpoint, as you are aware, the AtScale technology works on the concept of autonomous data engineering, which means we create aggregate tables based on user query patterns, and there is a ML and AI engine built into the AtScale platform that does that for you. So where do we store those aggregates? And we need a schema to store those aggregates. So when you're talking to your data warehouse team, when you're talking to your backend team, you will need to tell them that we need a schema to store the AtScale aggregates. And AtScale will need the select, update, create, and drop permissions on that schema, because as you can imagine, AtScale is creating aggregates and it is maintaining those aggregates. So the aggregates go through the life cycle of being created and being destroyed based on certain rules. So we need the select, update, create, and drop permissions in that schema. In addition to the schema for aggregates, there is AtScale also installs user-defined aggregate functions, the UDAF. These are HLL functions, which are internally used by aggregates for various reasons. Now, you can create a separate schema for installing this user-defined aggregate functions, or this UDAF can be installed in the same schema as the aggregate. So from a data perspective, AtScale will connect to your data warehouse or the backend system you have in place or in the cloud. But it is important for you to know that you will need at least one schema where AtScale will store the aggregates and the user-defined aggregate functions. Now, as far as the data warehouse is concerned, as you're aware, AtScale can connect to various data warehouses. The primary one everyone has been working with is, we kind of started with Hadoop. So we do have support for Hadoop. We have support for Snowflake. We have support for Google BigQuery. We have support for Redshift. So whatever database you're working with, what you should be aware of from an AtScale system perspective is that there are three query channels AtScale will communicate to your data warehouse with. And when I say three query channels, those query channels have been categorized as large interactive queries, small interactive queries, and system queries. Diving a little deep into what these categorization mean, if you see on the screen, a large interactive query is a query which AtScale believes that cannot be served by an aggregate and has to go back to your data warehouse and join or get the results from the base tables, right? So that is at a very high level categorized as a large interactive queries. There may be other scenarios, but at a very high level, that would be a large interactive query. Then this other classification is the small interactive queries. Small interactive queries are queries which AtScale serves from the aggregates. These are very highly optimized queries which can be served from the existing aggregate tables AtScale has created, and they don't have to go back to the base tables. System queries are queries such as the aggregation generation queries and statistics queries. AtScale is generating aggregates based on user pattern and the ML and AI engine built in, right? And there are statistics query as well. So AtScale is gathering information about the query patterns, the user base, the incoming queries, and trying to use that intelligence to generate the aggregate structures which will be meaningful and helpful to serve not just the immediate query, but the future queries that come in, right? So those queries are classified as system queries. What is important for you to also understand is that since we have these three channels or three categorizations of queries, you can assign different engines to serve this workload. So in a Hadoop environment, if you have Apache Spark and Hive, you can route your small interactive queries to Hive, and you can route your large interactive queries to Spark, or you can, and in addition, you can, route your system queries to Spark as well. So based on the capacity of your SQL engines, you can assign those workloads to these three categories. I'm going to go back to an AtScale implementation I have, and I wanted to show you. Now, this is I'm trying to show this to you because we believe every client we are working with is either moving away from Hadoop and starting their cloud journey, right? So either everybody is very interested in cloud data warehouses, be it Snowflake, Redshift, or Google BigQuery. So what you're seeing on my screen is in the data warehouses tab. So this is the AtScale UI, and if I go to settings and if I go to the data warehouses, you see I have connections to a bunch of data warehouses. The first one is going to the BigQuery. I have a connection to Postgres. I have a connection to the Redshift data warehouse. And I also have a connection to Snowflake data warehouse. And if I expand the Snowflake data warehouse here, what I wanted to show you was what I was talking about, the small interactive queries, the large interactive queries, the system queries. But what is important for you to take away from here is that you see I have a couple of connections here. You can create any number of connections, which essentially are SQL engines or pipeline for AtScale to talk to your backend systems. So if you see here from a Snowflake world, we have connected to a small Snowflake data warehouse, and we have connected to a extra large Snowflake data warehouse. Now, this is a demo machine, and I have all my queries going against the extra large data warehouse. Now, I have the ability to say, okay, I want my small interactive queries to go to the small data warehouse. So as you can see, it is very interesting as you're making the transition to the cloud to be aware that AtScale has the capability, or AtScale provides you the capability to utilize resources in a more meaningful and cost-effective way. When you move to cloud, Snowflake, as I said, they have these data warehouse configuration, which are elastic in nature. They have small, medium, large, extra large. So the higher the configuration, the more money you pay. So if you have AtScale on top of Snowflake, the advantage is not only the performance gains you will get with AtScale, it is the cost saving you get with AtScale, because what you are able to do now is you are able to say, okay, create my aggregates in the small data warehouse in Snowflake and route all my small interactive queries to that data warehouse. So suddenly what you have done is all the user queries that are being served by the aggregate are going to the smaller data warehouse, and only the queries that require data from the raw tables or the base data tables would be served from the medium, large, or extra large data warehouse you have. So you're not hitting your extra large data warehouse at all times. And that's how you see the tremendous cost saving. I would highly encourage you to talk to your CSM or AE. If you are moving to Snowflake, we have a calculator which is demonstrating, which can demonstrate, the cost savings from a, AtScale perspective you can have if you deploy AtScale with Snowflake. So that's very important. As I said, you are gaining performance as well as huge cost savings. Let me go. So the other considerations I wanted to bring to your attention was automation. Now, when we talk about automation, AtScale does have the capability of webhooks. And one of the automations our customers have done, and you can do it as well, is when you publish a project or you publish a cube, and there are other webhooks available, and you can look at the complete list of webhooks. What I've mentioned here on the slide is custom GitHub integration solution. So if you're publishing a project and you want that to be integrated with GitHub for version control, it can be done. And the way it can be done is you can enable the webhook on the publish of a project and receive that trigger. And once you receive that trigger, you can download the XML for the AtScale project and push that into GitHub, right? So a lot of our customers who require or want version control, which is usually the case, they use the AtScale webhooks to achieve that level of integration or automation. The other consideration I have mentioned on my slide here is aggregate refresh. A lot of people have this question of, okay, especially when you are deploying AtScale for the first time and you hear that, we create aggregates and there is a schema that you will need to dedicate to AtScale for aggregate creation. The next obvious question is, how are the aggregates refreshed? How do we refresh the aggregates? Because obviously you don't want stale data. So there are three options when it comes to aggregate refresh. One is schedule based. Obviously you can trigger the aggregates to refresh based on a schedule. There is a file trigger and there is an API trigger. The file trigger, as the name is suggesting, if you have a Hadoop environment and you have files that are landing in your environment, you can trigger the AtScale aggregate refresh based on when a file lands in a certain directory. The third one, which is more enterprise, is the API trigger, where you are able to use the AtScale APIs to refresh aggregates. So once your data load is complete, you can use the AtScale APIs to trigger the AtScale aggregate refreshes. Finally, I want to share this capacity planning slide and key points with you as you are deploying your AtScale solutions. A couple of points on capacity planning. One is when you're deploying a new solution, there is an initial number of users you will have, right? So you are doing a capacity planning. So you're looking at the number of users you will have in the system, number of concurrent users you may have in the system. And from an AtScale standpoint, because it is going to serve your reporting or the dashboarding and ad hoc analysis needs, you should always also look at the number of queries, the number of reports, the number of dashboards you are planning to deploy with AtScale. The reason I am bringing this to your attention is, as you can see, there are two settings in the first part of the slide, which is connection pool user max connection and connection pool group max connection. Now these settings have some bearing on how your system will perform. And that is why I have listed those under the number of users and number of concurrent users category. So from an AtScale standpoint, when a query comes in, query will come in, AtScale will rewrite that query and send it to your backend database or data warehouse or data platform. So AtScale acting as a pass-through engine, but the number of users or number of concurrent users matter, because suddenly if you have a large number of concurrent users and these settings are not set appropriately, then you will see queuing in the AtScale platform. And when queuing happens in any platform, you will see degraded performance. So it is very important for you to do the initial capacity planning, know the number of users you will be launching the platform to, and the number of concurrent users, and work with your CSM and the AtScale professional services team to understand these connections and these pool sizes and set them accordingly. Now, when it comes to the number of queries, you also need to look at the number of queries affect the number of aggregates. So there is a finite number of aggregates that will be created in the system, and that is a setting. So if I go back to my AtScale installation and go back to the aggregate screen in my environment, you can see I have the retention limit at 300. What that means is that there will be 300 aggregates created, and after the 300, there is a buffer, and after the buffer, AtScale will start dropping the least used aggregates. So it is important for you to know what kind of workloads you are anticipating, so you can set the right number of aggregate limit and the retention limit, because it is very important that you have enough aggregates in the system to serve at least upwards of 90% of your queries, so that those queries are performant. Carol, I think I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions.
I don't see any questions at this time, but if any of our attendees would like to type something into the chat box or the Q&A box, we're certainly ready to take your questions.
Okay, while we are waiting for any questions, just let me know if a question pops up. Otherwise, I think I have, I was going to go to this last slide here, which is the other key aspect which everybody wants to know about is how should we design our data? And this is the topic of our next webinar, where I will be going, taking a deep dive into how you should design your data for an at-scale implementation. There are approaches out there. One of the approaches is, should we denormalize our data? Should we go with a star schema, or should we go with a hybrid approach? How are the aggregates stored? So it's a topic that will be dedicated. We'll discuss this in our next webinar, and hopefully, that'll help you create an at-scale platform that is performant and efficient for your users.
Sounds good, Kamlesh. Hey, you've done a very thorough job today. I don't see any questions from our attendees. So I think at this point, we will conclude today's webinar. And for all our attendees on the phone, you will be getting a copy of the on-demand version of this recorded webinar. Thank you for your time today.